Byzantine politics was built on alliances and sudden collapses. Powers shifted quickly, and emperors knew that a single mistake could turn the entire empire against them. Justinian too was a strong and ambitious ruler, but he made enemies in both the army and the aristocracy. When a revolt finally succeeded, the rebels understood that killing him outright might turn him into a martyr. Instead, they used the traditional Byzantine method for eliminating a political rival: they mutilated him. In the Byzantine system, a man who was physically deformed could not rule. The rebels believed that by destroying his face and attacking his manhood, they were ending his political life forever. Historical accounts describe his mutilation without emotion, as if it were routine. His nose was cut off, his face was disfigured, and he was subjected to genital mutilation to ensure he could never produce heirs or claim the throne through dynastic legitimacy. The Byzantines often used castration on political prisoners because it weakened their claim to leadership and prevented them from starting a new bloodline that could threaten the ruling family. What makes Justinian's story extraordinary is that he survived. Most victims of such injuries died from infection or blood loss. But Justinian lived, escaped exile, and spent years gathering allies. Even with a disfigured face and a mutilated body, he managed to return to the empire and reclaim the throne. His enemies had believed that castration would erase his influence forever. Instead, he turned his suffering into a motive for brutal revenge. In medieval Europe, castration was sometimes applied to political rivals or criminals accused of sexual crimes or treason. A famous example is Robert Guiscard's enemies in 11th century Italy. After rebelling against the Norman duke, some captured opponents were castrated before imprisonment or execution. The aim was clear: prevent them from producing heirs while reinforcing the ruler's authority. These acts were recorded in chronicles and legal documents as a deliberate, public method of punishment. Another extreme case involved the English rebel Eustace the Monk in the early 13th century. After being captured by French forces, he was reportedly subjected to castration and other mutilations as part of his execution. This was intended both as revenge and as a deterrent for others who might challenge the authority of kings and nobles. The mutilation made him powerless politically and symbolically erased his threat to the ruling class. In the Byzantine Empire, political rivals were often castrated to prevent them from claiming power. The most notorious case is Basil the Macedonian's enemies. Basil I, who rose from common origins to emperor, ordered the castration of certain aristocrats to secure his throne and prevent rival heirs. Castration was preferred over execution in some instances because it eliminated a man's ability to continue a bloodline, while leaving him alive as a permanent example of imperial authority. In Renaissance Italy, Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, orchestrated political executions that included mutilations and castrations of captured enemies. While not all victims are named, chronicles of the Borgia campaigns describe the use of such extreme measures to intimidate opponents and consolidate power. Castration in these cases functioned as both punishment and political strategy, reinforcing fear among rivals. Even in more modern Europe, castration occasionally appeared as a legal penalty for sexual crimes. In 18th-century Germany, courts sanctioned castration for men convicted of repeated sexual assault, often combined with imprisonment. These cases were intended to prevent further crime and serve as a public warning, demonstrating that the state could enforce control through extreme bodily punishment. Across these examples, a clear pattern emerges. Castration as punishment or execution was deliberate, intended to remove power, shame the individual, and prevent the continuation of family lines. Unlike other forms of killing, it left survivors alive in many cases, ensuring that their suffering continued as a warning. Historical records show that this method was used consistently in Europe to reinforce political, social, and legal authority. One of the most infamous examples comes from the Mongol conquests. Their generals understood psychological warfare better than most armies in history. When a city resisted too long, Mongol soldiers sometimes castrated surviving fighters before executing them. Similar brutality occurred in Central African conflicts. Among some tribal battles in earlier centuries, warriors mutilated their enemies to claim dominance. Removing an enemy's genitals symbolized absolute victory. The act was often done publicly so the opposing tribe understood that their fighters had been stripped not only of life, but of future generations. In the Balkans, during the long wars between Christian and Ottoman forces, there were documented cases of soldiers being castrated and mutilated before being sent back to their commanders. Among all the systems in world history that relied on forced castration, none reached the scale of the Ottoman Empire's network of black eunuchs. It became the largest, most organized, and most deadly structure of its kind. For centuries, African boys were taken from regions like Sudan, Ethiopia, and Chad, transported across deserts, and sold into a system where their bodies were reshaped to fit the needs of the imperial court. What made the Ottoman system exceptionally brutal was the method used. Historical reports describe complete removal of the genitals, not just the testicles. The wound was sealed using heated instruments or boiling oil. The operation was carried out secretly and quickly, often by individuals who had no medical training. Mortality rates were extremely high. Many boys died within hours from blood loss, while others suffered severe infections during the journey to the capital. Only a small fraction survived long enough to enter palace service. Those who lived became part of an elite but restricted class. They were assigned responsibilities inside the Topkapi palace, managing the harem, controlling access to the sultan, and overseeing internal security. Some rose to powerful administrative roles, shaping political decisions and influencing succession debates. Despite their authority, their personal lives remained completely controlled. They were not allowed families, independent wealth, or freedom of movement. The system developed an economic structure around it. Slave traders made significant profits by transporting boys across long routes, knowing that only a portion would survive the operation. The Ottomans paid high prices for eunuchs who were already healed, turning the survival of a child into a financial advantage for the seller. This demand fueled more raids, more kidnappings, and more forced operations. What stands out in this history is how the empire justified the practice. It was seen as necessary to protect the privacy of the royal household and maintain political stability. Official records often describe the eunuchs as trusted servants rather than victims. Their loyalty was praised, but the trauma that created that loyalty was ignored. The empire built an administrative machine in which suffering was simply part of the cost. The Ottoman eunuch system lasted for centuries and ended only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, long after many other empires had abandoned such practices. It left a historical legacy marked by silence. Most of the men who lived through it left no personal accounts. They entered the palace as boys, lost their identities through violence, and spent their entire lives serving an institution that depended on their forced transformation. There were moments in history so brutal that even the chroniclers struggled to write them down. One of those moments came in the 13th century, when the Mongol armies swept across Central Asia. Their victories were swift, their punishments unmatched, and their cruelty became a signature of their rise. Among the countless horrors that followed their conquests, one method stood out because it was designed not just to kill, but to erase a man's dignity completely: castration. When the Mongols captured cities that resisted too long, they did not simply execute the fighters. They often used mutilation as a message. Cutting off a man's genitals was not only a form of punishment, it was a political statement. It declared that the defeated enemy would never father children, never rebuild a bloodline, and never challenge their power again. Chroniclers from Persia and China wrote that piles of mutilated bodies were sometimes counted by the number of severed genitals taken as trophies. It was a system meant to destroy hope at its root. But the Mongols were not the first to use this cruelty. Long before them, ancient empires had already understood the power of this punishment. The Assyrians, the Persians, and later the Romans used castration to weaken captured populations. It was used to humiliate enemy rulers, to control prisoners of war, and to turn children into eunuchs who served in royal courts. Every era had its own version of this brutality, but the Mongols amplified it on a scale the world had never witnessed before.